welcome each and every one of you to this GC Roundtable discussion. We've been doing these GC Roundtables really since the start for a long time, so we're really excited to do one today on such a top of mind and important topic, specifically generative AI, specifically how to tame the digital beast when you are a general counsel, when you are in-house. This GC Roundtable is brought to you on behalf of the fourth floor, per usual, but also on behalf of a fantastic, truly one of its kind law firm, Outside GC. So we are so excited to bring the insights that are going to be shared today, the incredible panelists, with our legal community at the fourth floor, and also everyone else who is here on this call that is not necessarily part of the fourth floor, but welcome. And so before we dive into the meat, I do just want to say a little bit about the fourth floor. For those of you that don't know, we are a special kind of marketplace. We match startups and companies to board-ready women. We do it in a trusted, efficient, and really very cost-effective way to disrupt the systemic barriers that have kept women out of the board candidate pipeline historically, and we're also matching underrepresented founders and fund managers with women angels and LPs, so we can help to disrupt those barriers, those systemic barriers that have kept women from writing checks and getting funded. So that's a lot of what we're doing at the fourth floor. If you are listening to this and you are a founder of a startup, please consider joining us so you can tap into the very talented pool of 1,500 plus board ready women. So you can build out your advisory and governing boards in our board seat exchange, and also seek funding in our back room if you qualify for that, and benefit from a powerful peer network of over 800 other startup founders. Board ready women, if you're listening, you might be an executive at a company. Your company might want to join us as well. That's an option. You individually can join us if you're looking to advance your for-profit board career and or start investing. So all those things are an option. Please come to a platform tour. We're dropping that link into the chat right now. That's the best way to get started, to apply for membership, to learn how to join us and get started on the journey. So enough about the fourth floor. Let's now get to the point of today. Now, to kick us off and to moderate this GC Roundtable, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome to the spotlight Caroline McCaffrey. Caroline is many things. Caroline is a very long-time member of the fourth floor. In fact, you were definitely there at its inception, for sure. Caroline is also the founder and CEO of ClearOPs, which is a cybersecurity and privacy startup, which is a fantastic company, very interesting. I'm guessing it might come up in the discussion today. She's also a former general counsel for a couple of different tech companies, including an AI tech company. She is a former lawyer, big law lawyer, venture lawyer, and currently, right now, she is a partner at Outside GC. So now it is true that I am entirely biased when it comes to Outside GC for many reasons. One, loved Outside GC as a general counsel myself. It's truly a unique, unparalleled resource. I love Outside GC as a resource for the 800 startups in the fourth floor. I love Outside GC as a resource for the 500 GCs at the fourth floor, at companies of all sizes. For those of you that don't know about Outside GC, their business model is truly special and unique. So there are no associates. They only are hiring partners at the firm, individuals who have, almost all of them have been in the GC seat at some point, maybe multiple times. They're extremely knowledgeable. And the best thing is that it's one very low rate for everyone. And there's no billable hours for the lawyers. So the lawyers are really happy. So anyway, long story short, if you are in-house somewhere, or you are in charge of making these decisions at a smaller company, if you have not thought of Outside GC, truly, it could be your secret weapon. So I cannot strongly endorse it more. Caroline, in her seat as a partner there, she has a specific expertise when it comes to AI policies. And of course, Caroline, I'm gonna let you talk about this more, but if anyone is listening and is grappling with what do I do in-house to really get this right and to thread the needle and to have a robust policy that makes sense and is practical, it's really good you're here. You're going to hear about that today in this conversation, but also feel free to reach out to Caroline, in direct message her. You can find her on LinkedIn, and of course in the fourth floor. So, okay, with that, Caroline, let me turn the stage over to you to introduce yourself more fully and to introduce your panelists.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Breen. Really excited to be here and to moderate this panel today. I think it will be a lot of interesting content. Just to kind of tag on to what Breen just said about outside GC. I actually used outside GC when I was a general counsel at Sailthrough, specifically because I found the commercial contracts that were coming in the door were overwhelming. And so I turned to OGC for help. And so then a few years later, I said, hey, you guys looking for lawyers? I really liked working with you when I was a GC myself. And so I can't, praise the organization enough. But that's enough about other people. Let's talk about our panelists. I'm really excited to talk to our two panelists today who are true experts on the topic. First, I want to introduce Angela Williams. Angela holds a JD and an MBA and has worked for some of the most respected technology companies in the world, such as Dell, Microsoft, and Google. She's currently at Meta, where she's a privacy product strategy lead for Reality Labs. I will let Angela discuss more about what that means. And she's also on several advisory boards. She's self-described herself to me as a lawyer and a tech executive working on the policy side of AI, with a specialty in bringing new products to market and using AI to improve the products, and then writing policies to protect the clients and downstream clients. She's on a mission to help companies use data responsibly. So welcome, Angela.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome, Carolyn.
And then for our other panelists, I'd like to introduce Meghan Anzelc. Meghan holds a BS, an MS, and a PhD in particle physics. And when she said she had a PhD in particle physics, I had to ask her what that meant. She spent her early career at insurance conglomerates such as Travelers in Zurich, North America. She is currently at 3Arc Advisory, where she is focused on advising companies about product roadmaps and strategy, with a specialty focus on data analytics that drives decisions around digital transformation, including the use of AI and machine learning to drive business value. She has over 20 years of experience using data science and AI to solve business problems. Meghan also gave a presentation last month on what boards should know about AI and generative AI, and was recently quoted by DCRO Institute on how boards should be thinking about AI. So Meghan, thank you for joining us, both of you.
Thanks for having me.
Looking forward to this. Okay, so I thought what might be a little fun, and I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I probably should give a little bit about myself while I'm doing this. So my name is Caroline, as Breen said. I am a partner at OGC, and also I founded a company called ClearOPs, and ClearOPs just recently integrated with OpenAI's technology. So, oops, supposed to go to the front, not the back. So I have particular experience not only in advising clients on how to use AI, specifically generative AI, and drafting policies and thinking about the risks involved, but I have myself implemented it in technology. And so I have some really technical information about how Gen AI works. So as you know, our presentation today is called Generative AI Unleashed. And I thought, let's do a fun little experiment with the different GPT chat models that are available, large language model chat bots that are available. And so I asked 3 of them a question: will AI replace the legal profession? I actually sent this in a LinkedIn post this morning. And so Bard says it could replace the legal profession. And there's a bit of debate about whether it will replace the legal profession. And then it's maybe too early to really make the call. GPT says, well, there's a debate going on. It may or it may not. A little bit more sort of like neutral, I found, on what it said in terms of responding to this question. And you have to know, every single time I prompted the exact same question with everything exactly the same, because even if you change one word, it can change the output. And then Bing basically said, probably not going to replace the legal profession. But I thought this was really interesting to see the difference between how these 3 different LLMs responded to this question. And so for the purpose of today's panel discussion, we will be focusing on 3 topics. And so I am going to ask both Meghan and Angela the first question, which is how to balance risk and foster innovation to propel your company forward as the GC. Sorry. trying to stop share. Okay, who wants to take the first one?
Yeah, I'll take the first one, Caroline. So, in my experience in working in tech, like I said, I started off really honing in on AI while I was at Google, and then furthermore, during my time at Meta, I spent a lot of time with product teams trying to understand what their goals were. What is the product we want to put out? What is the experience we want our customers to have? From that lens, I was able to better advise them on how to use AI more responsibly. Now, what does more responsible mean, right? Understanding where we're gathering the data, the underlying data that's feeding the AI. So is that data accurate? Are we asking the right types of questions? Are we asking the right people, right? Have we gotten enough of a population size, of a sample, to understand how we can best serve our customers, right? So I always see my role as the lawyer coming in and the strategist coming in, not to halt innovation, but to really make innovation more well-rounded, and ensuring, we're not just thinking about the 10% of our customers or even 20%, but we're thinking about all of the customers in different geographies with different personalities, different social mores and norms and whatnot, and really removing a Western bias of how generative AI can be used.
Meghan, I know you have something to add to this question.
Yeah, I think in my experience, right? So I'm probably one of the few people on the call who's not a lawyer, but that practitioner background of the experiences that I've had bringing new capabilities into organizations, I've often found it's really helpful to survey people on what they want from those new capabilities. So, generative AI is an example of asking people how they think they want to use it in their job, in the organization, how it might help them. And I think that kind of surveying can be really helpful for a couple of reasons. One is that many times the ways in which people envision a technology being used opens up a misunderstanding about what that technology can do. So that can sometimes help you then identify, oh, we actually already have solutions for the problems that you're identifying. So maybe it's a retraining or a refresh on training, or making the information more available. Other times people articulate issues that, generative AI is probably not the solution for, but there might be some other sort of analytical solution that is applicable. And so again, sort of getting those to the right people and connected to the people who are developing solutions that are appropriate to that problem can be helpful. And then you'll find the subset that are actually generative AI use cases where that's the appropriate tool and solution. And I think getting a sense of the breadth of ways that people are thinking about it can help as you and the organization are trying to determine what kinds of early experiments or proofs of concept you might want to do, what kinds of guardrails do you want to put in place, to really kind of use that input from the organization from a range of roles and levels to help you kind of figure out where to get started and where you might need to communicate more about the choices you're making and what people will be able to do and what they won't be able to do. So it can kind of give you a head start on getting in front of a lot of that kind of communication as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I completely agree with both of you. I think when we're to take a quick step back, generative AI, the point of it is it's really just a syntax model, right? It's predicting words that follow the word before, and we have seen a proliferation of use that was outside of the intent of the model to begin with. So when we're talking about risks, I can think of three kind of offhand, which is one, if you're building with generative AI in your company, which Angela, I think Meta is doing, and then, or your company is using generative AI. So I think, Meghan, you talked to a lot of companies that are thinking about maybe I should be using a third-party tool that helps me use generative AI in-house. But now we have a third risk, which I think is somewhat new for companies, which is these models, ChatGPT, Bard, Bing, your employees can use it without you ever knowing. So I know that's kind of an additive to this, but going to the next question, which is there's a lot of uncertainties that come with adopting these AI technologies. So putting in that frame of mind. So how do we establish policies that are going to cover all of these potential risks and find the sweet spot, so to speak, between being cautious, but then also making sure we're competitive as a business and making progress? Meghan, I'll give this one to you.
Sure. So I totally agree with you, Caroline. I think this in some ways highlights something that has likely been happening in other ways with other kinds of tools for a long time in organizations. So one example, past organization I worked with, a number of the senior executive team was using an app on their iPads as a teleprompter for when they were doing videos and talks to the organization. So all internal communication, right? And the teleprompter app really helped them with their scripting and their, coming across more natural. So totally valid use case. The app they were using had never been vetted by the information security team, never been vetted by the legal team. And someone had suggested that I use it, and I went and read the user agreement of what happens with the data, and there were really no good protections around the data being captured, right? Dumping your writing, your voiceover into the tool. And so I never used it and came up with other ways to sort of work around that for the work that I was doing. But I use that as an example of, I think there have always been tools people were using kind of outside the boundaries of what the organization both wanted people to be doing and probably knew about. And so I do think that sort of regular kind of surveying or finding informal ways to gather from people, like how are you using different apps or different technology, can be helpful when you're trying to figure out the guardrails. So that's one. I think the second point is, in determining the guardrails, I think coming back to the foundational kind of fundamental pieces. So what, one kind of core question that I ask over and over and over is, the data that I put into the tool, how is that data protected? How can it be used? Who else might gain access to it? And am I comfortable with the protocols and policies of the tool in how that data is going to be used? And I'm going to talk to my legal team and my information security teams and others to make sure they too are comfortable with how that data is being used. So I think coming back to a handful, it's really not a large number, but just a handful of core questions that, regardless of whether it's a teleprompter app on your iPad or ChatGPT or Bard or Bing, those questions kind of cover all of those different tools and use cases. Angela, I'm sure you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I was really just going to echo a lot of what you said there, Meghan, right? When I think about, policies around how, employees should be using these generative AI models for their own work, I think about, the general employment, policies that we typically have of, don't talk about what you do at work. This is private. Don't put this on your personal computers. Don't, download apps to the corporate phones for the very reasons that Meghan outlined. So I think when I think about those scenarios, I really do believe we have there are policies already, there's a framework in place about how to have those conversations and how to protect, inside corporate information. I will say it is also important to continue to reinforce that and to call things out very specifically of, hey guys, ChatGPT gives you false cases. So maybe don't use that in writing a brief, right? But being specific in how you, identify, I know this is a shortcut people might try to use, so let me head this off ahead of time is very important. But I think that there is not necessarily a change or a special change that needs to be made around protecting company information from employees using ChatGPT, because already they shouldn't be using a lot of apps and things that have not been vetted by the InfoSec team.
Absolutely. And Angela, you're in the unique position of being at Meta, which is pretty well known for being a technology forward company.
Mhm.
I would probably argue that they take risks and are comfortable with that. So how are you balancing that in your role, where you're kind of saying, okay, slow down a little bit, everybody, like, let's put some policies in place, let's think about this. And I know we have some questions in the chat, but I'm just so curious as to how you personally kind of, manage between what the mantra of the company, mission of the company is, and the environment, the culture, with what your specific job role is.
Yeah, I mean, it's not much different than any other really innovative technology that comes across, my plate, right? I sit back, I sit with the product team. I'm a lawyer that really believes in working closely with product to understand what they are wanting to accomplish. So I sit with the product teams and I have very frank conversations of, what is it that you're wanting to do? What is it that you're trying to do? Outlining some of the risk of, okay, if we go down this route, this is a risk. If we go down route B, this is a risk. If we're trying to get to, this one specific place, there are a whole alphabet of other routes that we can take that offer less risk. Can we explore those, right? So I take a very hands-on approach of working with my product teams to understand what goals they want to accomplish, not just offering them a no, but offering them suggestions on how to get their needs met, as well as protect the company. So I do that with, all kinds of innovative technology. When we're talking about VR, AI, whatever, it all
Sure.
is risky. It all is scary. It all comes with its own set of benefits and risks. And I take each one as it comes, and I will have those conversations with the appropriate team members.
That makes sense. And I mean, from your background, you were just a pro at doing this. And Meghan, but I do want to follow up with something you said, which is the terms of use now, every company has a terms of service, terms of use online that talks about how what licenses are being provided to you when using this technology. Now, what's been interesting in the generative AI space that I have seen, and I think you kind of alluded to it, is that there's all sorts of nuances to how companies are actually saying they're using the data. Like ChatGPT, for example, when it first came out, said that they could use your input for the consumer models like ChatGPT and DALL-E, but if you're using the APIs, they were not using your input. They didn't want to add that to the training data set. So would you think that now terms of use and terms of service have all of a sudden become a game changer in terms of what companies will be considered adopted by companies versus, by potential buyers, versus what buyers will not use?
Yeah, I mean, certainly they've always been important, right? So I think to Angela's earlier point, it's not so much that the rules or the guardrails have changed considerably. I just think all of this is being kind of brought more to the forefront, which is great in a sense that it gives you lots of opportunity to have more of these conversations proactively, as Angela was alluding to. What I do think is there's more subtlety to be thinking about than perhaps in the past. I think, right, and again, not lawyer perspective, right? So the practitioner and layperson view. But what I've seen reading a lot of these is that, one, a lot of the cutting edge sorts of tools have either very kind of broad and vague descriptions about what might happen with the data, which can be of obvious concern, or they're explicitly so sort of give them all ability to do anything in perpetuity, right? Like overly broad in ways that I know my legal teams would never agree to. However, I think there's some other pieces that I've seen where I haven't seen good clarity because the documents themselves are silent on one aspect. So an example of that is I had read the ChatGPT user agreement from early March. So this is a while ago, but they were clear, as you said, Carolyn, about ways you could exclude your input data from training data sets. In addition, there was a piece in there that said, if you're governed by GDPR or CCPA, you actually have to take a proactive step and fill out another form, which I think most people missed. But the thing that the terms at that time were silent on was what happens with all of my metadata. Mm-hmm. So the names and user IDs of the people using the tool, the IP addresses, the topics, right? So it might not be saving your actual prompts, but is it saving anything about the topic areas or the outputs that it's generating? I never saw anything in the user agreement that discussed that. And so I actually, right, it's not clear what they're doing with it, in which case I assume that they're going to use it any way they can for benefit to their own organization. So I think there's areas that are either unclear or more gray than in the past, and that these user agreements for these more cutting edge tools are changing quite a bit over time, right? The version March 1st was very different than the version that was available February 28th. And I'm sure it's changed multiple times since then. So that's the other part, is that there's a lot more agility on the part of the teams involved in keeping up to date with all of this than I think we've experienced in the past, where, you know, other organizations I can think of where I use third-party data sources or other tools, their terms of service were much more static. They didn't change very often. So it was kind of a lower burden on the organization and the people involved to figure out what to do.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think, you know, lawyers are actually in higher demand, because now instead of reviewing an agreement once and being like, okay, we signed, that's it, it's locked in. Now we have to review it literally sometimes every single day for new changes. But Angela, I want to ask you a question that was asked by Aravinda in the audience. Everyone knows the Samsung case, right? Basically, Samsung employees input code into ChatGPT to get an output, or maybe it was Codex. I'm not exactly sure which model they were using, and then found that code became output that others could access. So in this case, it sounds, I mean, I don't know the facts of this, but perhaps Samsung was okay or didn't have a policy yet on generative AI, or something happened that the employees thought that they could use it to generate code and it was permissible. And Samsung went completely the opposite way and locked it down. They said, okay, banned. What do you think about that as sort of someone who's responsible for policy and seeing, what were your thoughts when you read that?
I mean, I think I had similar thoughts as to everyone, right? It's I go back to kind of the policies of the typical employment policies of keeping company information, you know, kind of sacred and internal. And, you know, the first thing I'm thinking was, well, why did they think they could use this model for their work? Why was that a thought that they had? And the next part was, I think Samsung did the correct action afterwards of locking everything down, right? I certainly don't think I would have had a different response. I don't know internally what they're doing. I would have had more I definitely would have more conversations with my teams around, this is why this is not a good tool to use just unabashedly. Use it on your own, right? But not for things we're doing here, particularly not for innovative things that are coming up on the roadmap. Things that are 5 years already in market, sure, whatever, right? You're probably not as protective of that information. But just to also piggyback off of what Meghan was saying earlier, part of it is reading the T's and C's. Another big part of it is I have to work with my InfoSec teams to understand, where is this information being held? Because it's one thing for your T's and C's to say, oh, we'll never use your information. We won't let anyone else have access to it. But if it's being held, let's say in China, where the government could potentially go get access to it, well, how helpful are the T's and C's at that point, right? So it is more of a question of not just reading the T's and C's on our end, but also understanding, where is the data being held? How easily can we go in and delete our data, right? And what kind of political environment do we have around any certain location where data is being held? So it is a much more nuanced conversation than reading the T's and C's, and brings in a lot more stakeholders, particularly from the InfoSec team, around, you know, are we comfortable with our data being hosted, you know, in these locations, or do we need to work directly with, you know, let's say a ChatGPT, right? I'm making this up. But do we need to work directly with one of these generative AI models to have something that we use only internally, that we know lives on our server? So if we want to delete it, we can, and we don't have any questions about who has access to it.
Such a good point. I mean, you know, in my role as an outside GC, I have constantly read OpenAI's terms, Microsoft's terms, Google's terms, which they're actually hard to find. Microsoft a little bit challenging too, but and watching the sort of the difference between what they're saying and how they're actually positioning their privacy and data security as a bit of a competitive edge, specifically Microsoft in this context. So really, really good point. You know, I have a bunch of questions here that I want to ask. Belinda asked, what are the panelists' perspective on using open source LLMs? I believe Meta is planning or has released or about to release an LLM that's open sourced. But I also really do want to hear, I want to hear both of your perspectives on this, but as a data scientist, I want to hear Meghan's perspective on an open sourced LLM as well from, you know, that side.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of these same principles apply, right? Of what exactly are you signing up for, right? What can and can't you use it for? How much information is being exchanged, right? All of those still apply to this conversation. I do think there's going to be a push, if there isn't already, from a lot of in-house data science and analytics teams to use those that become available because LLMs require so much data to be trained on. Most organizations don't have enough data, or certainly not enough data in a format that can be consumed by those models in order to build your own in-house, right? So I know like Bloomberg has said they're building one, but Bloomberg is clearly at the one end of the spectrum where they have an enormous volume of data that they have been capturing, you know, with quality and cleanliness and all of those things as well, I would presume, for many, many years. So I do think you're going to see a push from data science and analytics teams to get their hands on as many sort of either whether it's open source or other avenues to help them start figuring out how to build for their organizations. And I'm seeing this where, you know, CEOs and C-suite executives are saying, like, what are we doing with LLMs? Are we going to build our own, right? If they're freaked out by OpenAI or Bard or whatever, they're saying, what are we going to do in-house? Because we work in a highly regulated industry or whatever it may be, we want to build our own. So now there's pressure on the data science and analytics teams to do something. I would argue some of the conversation needs to be from those, you know, whoever your chief data science officer is, to have, right, a more measured, right, sort of not the frantic, right, hair on fire kind of conversation, but a much more measured, what are we trying to accomplish conversation. But I would say my guess would be that there's more pressure on the teams under them. So that would be one area of call out that if you haven't already, perhaps proactively reaching out to those teams, again, to say, what are you using? What do you want to be using? So you can get ahead of some of these things, right? And find that partnership and that approach. As Angela was saying, is there a slightly different approach that de-risks versus the one that perhaps your data science team picked first, right? Just because they were scrambling to respond to what they're hearing from their executives. So I think the same principles apply. And then I would say this is an opportunity to get ahead of, you know, any sorts of potential issues or risks by having those conversations proactively internally across your teams. Yeah,
absolutely. And Angela, I definitely would want to hear your thoughts on this, although I'm going to add on Hillary's question because it's kind of tangent to it, which is your thoughts on using open source LLMs for potential commercial use, which might be interesting just because of your perspective from Meta.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's precedent for it, right? A lot of companies, Google, Meta, a number of tech companies have been using federated learning for building out various internal and external AI models. So I think, you know, open source LLMs fall kind of within that same framework of how I think about, you know, would we use external information to build something? Sure, but we still have to go through the process of where's the underlying data coming from? Is this reflective of our customer base? Does this make sense for how we want to use it? And ensuring that from an ethical standpoint, we have a good representation of our customers' inputs included in whatever we're building, right? So it doesn't, there's no broad and kind of flat way of saying, yes, absolutely go use it. It is sure, that can be a data point. Let's take it through the same exercise that we do everything else when we're thinking about innovative technologies.
And go ahead.
Can I just add one sort of add on to build on what Angela was saying of the ethical side of it, right? So I think when you're talking about language models, one of the concerns that's been raised, and I know this has been kind of an ongoing conversation with GitHub as an example of for coding purposes, right? Are you using the intellectual property of others, right? Or the work of others in ways that then doesn't get attribution or recognition, or are you violating copyright laws? And that conversation gets even bigger and messier and more complex when you get into image generation, video generation, audio generation. So I do think that having a sense as an organization of what are your perspectives and sort of your starting point of on the ethical side of where do you want this data to have come from, that you as an organization are now benefiting from because those open source models relied on that information as input. So I just wanted to reinforce that point Angela was making, because that's one that gets missed a lot, I think, because it's a few layers deep, but deserves attention because there's some real potential risks there if you're not sort of thinking it through and paying attention up front.
Yeah, and you must have been, I don't know if you're reading the comments, but Drew was literally asking that question about using a vendor's Gen AI service and the risks associated with that potential output being an IP infringement. I'm just going to say personally, you know, from my founder hat at ClearOPs, we're really excited about open source LLMs, and we are looking at using it. So I'm in favor. But to your point about what's going on with GitHub's Copilot, there's a class action lawsuit that was filed actually, I believe in December of last year against it for exactly the reason of that it's code that was under open source licenses that may have had attribution requirements or other types of licensing requirements that has not followed the code snippets that are being presented to people. So this question that from Drew is, and hopefully I'm saying your name right, apologize if I'm not, is, you know, how should vendors be telling their customers who want to use these services and are afraid of this IP infringement about the risks? Like, how do you manage those particular risks? And I'm assuming, again, it might be in a policy, but it's, you know, I'd love for you to address that. And Angela, I'll let you go since Meghan was just talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an issue that a lot of my colleagues and I continue to struggle with, right? You can imagine, particularly from a meta standpoint, being a social media company, everyone likely is familiar with a lot of the conversation around, you know, Black creators not having the attribution they need for their IP, both on, you know, Instagram, TikTok, etc., right? Different social media platforms. So the ethical concerns of ensuring and protecting this marginalized population of people who don't get recognition is an ongoing issue of concern, and one, quite frankly, that we've not found a simple or straightforward answer to. It's one we are consistently trying to ask colleagues, you know, let's try this, see what works. We even ask our customers, like, what are some of the ways that we can be better at this? But if I'm honest, I've not yet found a solution that tends to really work for the masses.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me actually want to ask this question by Meredith, because I think it's a good one in terms of what you just said, which is some of these companies are like Microsoft is publishing these acceptable use policies that say you can't use our generative AI models unless you agree to doing it our way and according to this policy. And we all know, sorry, Angela, for saying this, but we all know how often people actually read policies. So what do you think about these limitations becoming more common? This is Meredith's question, and easily accepted by customers.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, listen, I think a policy is only as good as its ability to be enforced, right? And so if there is not an ability to preclude people from operating outside of the policy and ensuring that they're operating strictly within the guardrails of the policy, then you are relying upon trust. And do you trust your mass customer base? I wouldn't, right? Because people are people, right? People will make mistakes. People will try to find shortcuts. And so from my perspective, you know, I look at these policies and I'm thinking, again, policy is only as good as how it can be enforced. So my question is always, how are we going to enforce this, right? How are we going to enforce? Because also, we have smaller companies using, our our models or what have you. If we have smaller companies using that, it is not going to necessarily be a blow up for them in the Wall Street Journal. It is Meta's blow up. It is Microsoft. It is Google's, right? And so there's also the conversation with PR around if and when this goes bad, right? How are we going to say we've done everything that we can and earn and maintain our users' trust? Because that really, at the end of the day, is a primary concern, and why we're all here trying to protect this data and protect these models and ensure they're being used responsibly, is to maintain user trust. So if we do something, even in putting a policy together, if we were to allow it to be used with a company that we don't know, or we have no idea whether or not they can be trusted to act ethically, or how they're going to use it, understanding their process, then we haven't done our due diligence, right? So the policy is a piece of paper at that point, and not very helpful, and won't be helpful in maintaining user trust if it gets blown up on the front page of the journal.
Yeah, I mean, 100% what you said is so true. Meta gets in the press quite a bit. And so, Meghan, in terms of Angela's response, it made me think about, well, both of you work with product teams pretty closely. Is there an obligation on product teams to at least be aware that if there's sort of these guardrails of acceptable use, that maybe they should build the product in a way so that certain uses can't happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think some of this is about kind of what your upbringing has been in data science and AI spaces. So in my experience, I spent the first decade of my career in financial services. So in a very highly regulated space, very conservative, very risk averse, very slow moving. But the benefit of that is that I sort of had good training in my early career around knowing that I needed to build partnerships with the legal teams, the privacy teams, the compliance teams, with the regulatory bodies, right? With, that all of those constraints had to be part of my thinking. And in fact, is actually what I loved about the private sector versus, my academic physics background. So I had that training, and so I always bring that mindset and approach no matter where I go, whether it's a highly regulated space or not, of saying, is what I'm doing defensible? Have I thought through all of the different aspects and potential issues and risks? Have I built those partnerships before I've even started building a product, to really get that input from the legal team to say, again, sort of referring back to Angela's earlier point of, is there a lower risk way to pursue the solution we're building that serves the business, that adds value, all of those good things, but in a way that minimizes risk for the organization? So I think what you're highlighting, Carolyn, is kind of just one more perspective on that. But in my experience, it's very much based on kind of where you've come from as a data scientist, and if you've had that sort of built into your thinking. Because I've seen others who have come from other spaces that were less well regulated or a bit more free flowing in how they did things, and it doesn't even occur to them to have a conversation with their legal team, frankly, at any point in the process. And that obviously has other risks and causes everybody lots of headaches after the fact. So
yeah, absolutely. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here in a nod to our host, the fourth floor, and talk a little bit about generative AI company board representation. Now, I know both of you are on advisory boards and boards, proper boards themselves, and committees and things like that. So in this particular, discussion, how do you think that if someone is interested in joining a board or an advisory board, that they can distinguish between the winners and the losers if they're joining a generative AI company? I think this is a really interesting question.
Yeah, I think Meghan will probably talk a bit more about the winners and the losers from a technical standpoint. I'll tell you from my standpoint, being a lawyer and also being very very deep into the realm of ethical AI and ethical use, including generative AI. When I joined my first public board, it was a conversation I had both with the CEO as well as the chairman of the board to understand I wanted to understand how they balance ethics and profit, right? Essentially, we talked about how AI could be used. We talked about marginalized communities. We said, okay, what is the impact of building this out, and what's the downstream impact to these various communities? What's the downstream impact to children, right? And when I finally decided to join the board, it was because I felt comfortable that they lean much more towards ensuring they did no harm, particularly to marginalized communities, as opposed to putting profit first. So I felt comfortable in knowing that as a board member, I can come in, ask some really difficult questions, and know that it wouldn't be pushed aside, or it wouldn't be, seen as like, this person who just wants to disrupt innovation, but I want to actually help it by building a better product that doesn't then, continue to marginalize already marginalized communities. And for me, that was very important and very critical to me choosing to be a part of an organization and joining a board that worked with AI.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think joining a board is definitely about the people on the board and making sure that everyone supports each other and really respects each other's opinions, because you can find a lot of, there can be disagreement. Meghan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think in addition to the kinds of questions that Angela was highlighting in her experience, I think again there's a lot of very basic kind of data foundation questions you can ask, and right, I just want to point out this whole conversation we've used no math, no technical jargon, right? We're not talking about the nuances of how you build these algorithms. So I think that's important to keep in mind, is that asking questions that may sound overly simplistic to you are the right questions to be asking. What data was your tool built on? What was it from a geographic perspective, from a demographic perspective, from a time perspective? Do I think the data it was built on holds for the way in which you want to use your tool, right? A lot of the same sorts of questions I think you would ask in due diligence, either if you're exploring an acquisition, or if you're in the early conversations of a partnership with a vendor, right? I think a lot of those same sort of questions of what data was it built on? How did you train your model? How do you ensure that your model stays current? How often do you refresh? Exactly to Angela's points, how have you evaluated your tool to ensure you are minimizing potential for harm, right? Minimizing bias against groups, especially if some of those groups were not well represented in your training data set, right? Those are fairly straightforward questions to ask. And I have heard hundreds of pitches and had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with vendors. And it becomes clear very quickly when people cannot answer those questions that there's something not right about what they're doing, right? So it doesn't have to be a super deep dive. I think very early you can get a good feel for, do I want to continue the conversation with this organization? Or is the lack of answer or the uncertainty in the answer making me less confident about wanting to be a part or engage with this organization in some way? And certainly as a board member, right, when you have fiduciary responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it reminds me of a story that I've told a few times about my my time at ClearOPs. ClearOPs is an AI company that uses, or a deep learning company that uses image recognition technology, or developed image recognition technology. And when I first joined the company, it was very small. It was about 15 people. And every Wednesday they would give a presentation, something about the tech. And so one of the developers was showing different pictures and the tags that would correspond to those pictures. And in one, it had a woman's eye with very heavy makeup, and it said, one of the tags said smoky eye. And one of the developers asked the question of, why did it say smoky eye? And the developer who's presenting was like, I don't know. I'll make sure that gets out of that. And I was like, well, first of all, that's accurate. And I guess because most of the room was men, they didn't realize that. But secondly, how did it get in there? Just to begin with, if this person didn't was about to take it and remove it from the possibility of tags for an eye like that. So I bring that example up because I think it gives a real tangible of what you're both saying, right? Which is that these models, unfortunately, a lot of them are based on data that is biased. And so in order for us to truly move forward with any of these tools, I have thought of this, I've been passionate about this for a very long time, is that ethics in AI means diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like it's synonymous. Those are what has to happen in order for us to move forward with this. And I think anyone who's listening, when you look at using a generative AI tool, you should be also looking at that from the company's missionary statement. What are they talking about for themselves? How do they describe themselves? Are they actually forward in their mission on DE&I? We have another question, and I know we only have a few minutes left, so we are taking questions at this point. Co-pilot and copyright violations. Does anyone have any comment on this? I also saw someone talk about, Irina, oh no, someone mentioned the EU AI Act, which I know when we did our pre-call, we mentioned that too. I'm going to share my screen about sort of the risks of AI while we're talking, but I'd love if both of you could quickly share your thoughts on, Angela and Meghan, on the EU's AI Act and what that means in comparison to how the US is thinking about AI and adopting regulation. Angela, please start.
Oh, you know, I will say that I've reviewed the EU AI Act, and a number of my colleagues and I have discussed it. Personally, I am still trying to digest where I think that they are going with that, right? What I will say is I think that I trust EU as far as GDPR and how the stance they take on protecting people's privacy. Absolutely, I think that they are taking the right steps forward. From a technologist perspective, I see risk in being so prescriptive, but I think they're taking the right steps. I think the AI Act is, I won't say premature because I don't think that's correct, but I do think that there's a lot more innovation that we are on the precipice of, right? And I am always a bit nervous when things are in its nascent stages overly regulated without an understanding of its impact on innovation. But I'm also very nervous around innovation with no regulation. So I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, Carol.
No, I think you just did. You said you would like to see a balanced approach, and you're not sure that either the US or the EU is really hitting that.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. But I definitely want to give time to Meghan to respond.
So I would say two things. So one, I have not read it, so I don't have an opinion on the document or the legislation that's proposed itself. What I would say is, again, this is a point at which I go to my legal partners and say, right, what, and this one is obviously much bigger in the news, but many times there are much smaller things or impacting smaller segments of your customer base and your data. So going to my legal partners and having regular conversations about what regulation is on the horizon, what is both coming into play in the very near term, is being written into law, but also where do you think things are going over the next year or 2 or 3 years? Like what are we likely to see? And again, I think to Angela's earlier point about like exploring different paths and identifying which ones are lower risk. This has been a super helpful conversation series to me in organizations to then plan for how my teams build algorithms, right? So that if we know it's likely that X is going to happen, or this attribute is going to become a bigger concern and too many questions from regulators, and our legal partners are worried about it, can we do something different in our development to get ahead of a lot of those, so that we're not, again, on the back foot, right, once everything's launched into production, or we have to delay a release, right, because something just got written into law and we weren't prepared. So I think that proactive partnership and collaboration across the teams is super, super critical for this. The second thing I would say is that I think, as Angela said, I agree with her that especially when things are kind of new and young and everybody's still trying to figure this out, it's hard. I think that's a particularly hard situation to be in. I think I'd like to be hearing more of the highly regulated industries participate in these conversations, because so many of them have regulations in place that at least get to some of these foundational core pieces around, unfair bias into consumers, or protecting, ensuring protected classes aren't adversely impacted, right? Those sorts of things. Not that any of the highly regulated industries has it all figured out or has a perfect system, but I don't think we're starting from nothing. And so I'd like to see more kind of cross-industry conversation to say, what can we borrow and learn from the people who have been through this before in earlier iterations of similar kinds of technology, and how can we bring that into this conversation so that we can, start putting some of those common foundations in place, and then learn from each other about how to adapt and adjust, right, as these technologies become more mature and we have a better sense of what those guardrails should really be.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with you. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our generative AI panel. And thank you both, Angela and Meghan, for joining today. Breen, Kat, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.